In 1947, the United States and the Soviet Union began the Cold War. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union disagreed on the post-war world in Europe. As a result, and based on political conflict, military tension, and economic competition between both nations, the Cold War was started. It was called the Cold War because neither side wanted to fight physically against the other. The United States and the Soviet Union began developing long-range nuclear weapons to attack each other. During the early period of this Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were in competition to see who had more power. In October 1962, the United States received information that the Soviet Union and Cuba were working together making nuclear weapons to attack the United States. These weapons were medium and intermediate range ballistic nuclear missiles. The United States acquired this knowledge from their military U-2 spy plane that photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba. In June 1961, President John F. Kennedy, still getting used to being president, attended a meeting with Premier Khrushchev in Vienna to discuss the conflicts between the East and West. For example, the situation in Berlin. The two leaders were not able to reach a solution. This led President Kennedy to be looked upon as a weak president who lacked power in making decisions in the arms races. Premier Khrushchev knew that the United States had more nuclear missiles than the Soviets did. Also, he worried because he knew that the Americans had nuclear missiles in Turkey, which was 150 miles away from its borders. The Soviet Union once again wanted to balance the power out, and they did so by setting up bases in Cuba, only 90 miles away from the United States borders. This also helped Cuba defend itself from another invasion by the United States, like the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. When our President John F. Kennedy found out about these missile camps in Cuba being built by the Soviet Union, he kept it a secret so that the Soviet Union and Cuba would not find out that we had discovered their plan to attack the United States. The first thing President Kennedy did was he met with his advisors and discussed how to handle the situation. He created EXCOM, which stands for Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It was composed of officials from the United States government that advised President Kennedy during this crisis. EXCOM was made up of 12 members along with President Kennedy. These advisors would sit in on meetings with the president. After several days of meetings, the president announced his plan. The plan was to reinforce the naval bases in Guantanamo Bay and set up a naval blockade to prevent Russian ships to bring in shipments of supplies. He also demanded that the missiles are to be taken out of Cuba for the sites to be destroyed. Premier Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, authorized Soviet commanders in Cuba to begin their attack on the United States with the use of nuclear weapons if the United States armed forces invaded. For 7 days, the two most powerful nuclear superpowers in the world stared each other down. On the 8th day, Russian Premier Khrushchev held back on his challenge and agreed to move the missiles and the ships away from Cuban waters. This was believed by many the climax of the Cold War, in which a nuclear war almost began. On October 28, 1962, the Soviets agreed to dismantle the weapon sites if the United States agreed to not to invade Cuba. In another deal, which remained secret for over 25 years, the U.S. also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. This part of the deal was kept a secret between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. Cuban President Fidel Castro was mad because the removal of these nuclear missiles from Cuba meant that he lost the protection that the missiles gave Cuba and power. Fidel Castro insults the Soviet Union by saying that they were afraid of the United States. On November 20th, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, when the Soviet Union declared that the bombers left in Cuba would be removed in 30 days. The Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the greatest test of John F. Kennedy's presidency. The crisis had many positive factors. Within a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis had finished, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev had signed a nuclear test ban treaty, the first of its kind. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty prohibits nuclear weapons tests or other nuclear explosions underwater in the atmosphere or in outer space. It does allow underground nuclear tests as long as no radioactive debris falls outside the boundaries of the nation conducting the test. Also, the first hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow was installed. A hotline was a direct communication link between Moscow and Washington, D.C. The purpose was to have a way for the leaders of the two Cold War countries to communicate directly to solve such a crisis.